Remember, to earn this webcast and any accompanying materials are copyrighted by the American Association for Respiratory Care. Any public display, sale, copy, or distribution of the video or materials may only be undertaken with the prior written consent of the AARC. Copyright 2013, all rights reserved. My name is Shauna Strickland. I am a respiratory therapist, asthma educator, and Associate Executive Director at the AARC. I welcome you to today's presentation. Preparing the technology-dependent patient for home. Upon completion of this AARC webcast, participants will be able to identify ventilator capabilities and differentiate between critical care and home care, recognize at least 3 other adjunct therapies or treatments that must be considered when transitioning from the critical care setting, and identify 3 different caregiver groups that must be considered for training and provide strategies to accomplish this training. I am pleased to welcome Ms. Ronda Bradley. Ms. Bradley earned her respiratory therapy degree from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and earned her bachelor's degree in healthcare management and Master of Science degree in healthcare management from Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. She is owner and clinical sales specialist for Spiritus Consulting. Prior to developing her company, Ms. Bradley practiced critical care, neonatal, and pediatric respiratory therapy. I do not have conflicts of interest related to this presentation. Ms. Bradley discloses relationships with CareFusion, Essex Cryo, and Percussion Air. Brand names of products may be mentioned only as examples of technology. Rhonda, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Shauna. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today, and I hope to accomplish the objectives that we have set forth over the next 30 to 40 minutes in this presentation. Upon completion of the presentation, I hope to have time to answer some questions, but as Shauna mentioned earlier, my email address will be listed on the last slide. Please feel free to jot down my email address, and I welcome any conversation or questions that you might have. I'm also going to be referencing a couple of websites for video that unfortunately we're unable to play during the presentation, and if you're unable to catch those, no worries, just email me and I will get those to you. So I'll be presenting preparing the technology-dependent person for home. I think we're ready to go, and now what? So I hope that one of the things that we'll be able to accomplish is to talk through, and whether you're a critical care therapist, whether you work in the subacute environment or sort of the intermediate space, or in home care, that you'll find something to take away from this presentation. As Shauna mentioned, I do have some disclosures. I am a LLC business owner for a small distribution company, and I do have contracts with the following companies that you see listed. So let's get started. One of the things that we need to start thinking about from the beginning are in the early stages of discharge planning. So when we're still in the critical care mode, we're still in the critical care setting, one of the things that we need to first start by doing is recognizing the differences and potentially seeing limitations, but also benefits of some of our subacute and home care type ventilators. The first thing we need to look at is what mode of ventilation is the patient on. Many hospital ventilators have features that you may or may not find on ventilators that are used in subacute and home care environments, but many of them do. Unfortunately, in the critical care environment, unlike anesthesia, all of our ventilators are labeled differently. So this is a project that's kind of been started and stopped throughout the years to try to standardized nomenclature on our critical care or respiratory therapy ventilators. We still haven't gotten to that point, so sometimes there's some challenges with recognizing the labeling or terminology that's different on our ventilators one to another. So for example, rise time. Most ventilators call rise time, how fast the air is going to come in a pressure mode, either pressure control or pressure support. They may vary in the way that they do it or the way that it's labeled. For example, on the Puritan Bennett 840 ventilator, it's a percentage. In the Draker ventilators, it's actual time. On most of our home care and subacute ventilators, rise time is in some sort of profile, although some ventilators may have more option settings for rise time. So the key is really understanding how rise time works on your critical care ventilator and then making an even transition to the ventilator that you're using in subacute. That's why it's really important, critical care therapists, that you work together with the home care therapist. The ventilator that may be coming in for the transition may not be something that you're completely familiar with, so you may want to take a look at that. The second thing might be flow termination, e-sense, cycle sense, termination sensitivity. Unfortunately, lots of ventilators call this something different. So it's pretty much the same thing on every ventilator. It's the percentage of peak flow at which a pressure support breath will end, but it may be labeled differently. Again, different ventilators may have the different variances. Some of them may go all the way down to 10% and up to 80%. Some of them may go from 10% to 40%. So really knowing that critical care vent and knowing the ventilator that you're dealing with in the subacute setting is key. Some ventilators have specialty features that help deal with leaks, such as to keep patients in sync with the ventilator. So, for example, the LTV series of ventilators have something called time termination. It is sort of a secondary backup time to allow the ventilator to cycle off in the presence of a very large leak. That's what helps keep the patient in sync with the ventilator. Where other ventilators in the subacute space, like the Trilogy, have a very high leak compensation. And so typically the leak compensation will preclude the need for a time termination. So again, understanding what ventilator that you're transitioning to can be very helpful. Most subacute and home care ventilators don't offer ATC, or automatic tube compensation. So recognizing this when you're making your transition is very important. I know I find this a lot when I go into a critical care setting and I'm helping to make a transition onto a subacute care vent, that many times the physicians will say, oh, but we had to go up on the settings, the patient isn't doing as well on the subacute ventilator. And so for those of us who've been in respiratory therapy for over 20 years, we recognize there was a long time of doing critical care ventilation before automatic tube compensation was even available on ventilators. So it's easy for us to sort of think through, or hopefully it is, for us to think through how we would have compensated for volume loss and resistance differences that our newer critical care ventilators do automatically by zeroing to the tubing. Just remembering this and that the patient isn't getting quote-unquote worse because you might have to increase, particularly in volume ventilation, your volume settings, will really go a long way in making everyone comfortable with that transition. The last thing to consider on the ventilation piece is how does the patient tolerate stress? Do they have high oxygen flow needs in a stressful situation? So, for example, if you have a pediatric patient that every time they have that, as we lovingly call it, poop and die episodes, every time the patient has a bowel movement, they desat, they brady down, you have to turn them up to 60, 70, 80% FiO2. That's probably not a patient you're going to easily transition to a subacute ventilator. Remember, most of these ventilators don't have a blender in them, or if they do, you're trying to get them to the point where you're bypassing the blender so that you are setting them up for a home care situation where we don't have 50 psi oxygen. So the importance of this is recognizing that patients that frequently need very high levels of FiO2 might not be the best patients or easily transitioned. We sort of use a rule of thumb at 60%. That patients should standardly tolerate activities of daily living without needing more than 60% FiO2. Because many times our oxygen in the home is provided with an oxygen concentrator, we do have some limitations. One thing to think about, though, on the type of ventilator that you're utilizing is that in situations that there's a very large leak, ventilators with a lot of leak compensation might not be beneficial in a situation where you're going to need high oxygen needs. Think about that. If you have a patient that has a very high leak and under a stressful situation the leak gets worse, and you're only able to give X amount, say 5 liters through your concentrator, or maybe 10 into the side of the ventilator, the more the leak compensation ramps up, the more dilution you're going to have on the other side of the vent. So recognizing that and making sure that if you have the ability to turn off the excess leak compensation or go to a ventilator that doesn't have as high of leak compensation or a setup that doesn't require that might be helpful in the long run. Again, as I mentioned, there are limitations in your home care oxygen supply, so we need to be cognizant of that. Other things to consider. What about the kind of tracheostomy tube that the patient has? Does that tube meet their home needs? If the tube needs to be changed frequently, for example, our pediatric patients typically do not have an intercannula, and so if that tube needs to be changed frequently, say every 2 weeks, is that tube a disposable tube, or can it be cleaned and sterilized in the subacute setting or flash boiled for cleaning in the home care setting? Sometimes the tubes that are made out of materials that can be cleaned are actually more economical than the tubes that are disposable, just for that reason, that they can be cleaned and reused. What about a cuff? Do they need a cuff for airway protection, or can they go without a cuff? This area is kind of controversial, and there really isn't a lot of definitive information out there about what's best. Sometimes I find that it's regional to practice, that some ENT and pulmonary doctors don't want to ever discharge patients to home with a cuff, and others find that using a cuff, particularly a tube that can have a tight-to-shaft cuff, is actually very helpful because it allows you to protect the airway when you need to, guarantee ventilation when you need to, but also allows the patient to have cuff-down situations for speaking and vocalization. Other things to consider are mobility and flexibility. And I'm going to have a couple of slides that will go over that or sort of reiterate that point a little bit more. So who needs specialty trachs? I will tell you that at one point in my career, I was the director of respiratory at a pediatric subacute facility called Rankin Jordan Pediatric Hospital in St. Louis. And you'll hear more about that location as we go on. But I wanted to mention that now because this is one of my favorite little girls from there, and she's a perfect example of who needs a specialty trach. She has a Flex 10 trach in, and we can all see the reason why. She's got no neck. So just to be able to get to the tracheostomy tube for general suctioning or to connect a ventilator circuit if we needed to do that, create some challenges without that Flex tube. Again, I don't have any financial disclosures with Vivona Smiths, but I did want to mention their tube specifically because of a couple of features that I found to be very helpful. Again, mentioning the Flex tube, you do see that one at the bottom. The Flex tube allows there to be lots of movement on the distal end of the tracheostomy tube without moving the proximal end inside the patient. We've really found in pediatric mobility situations that this can be tremendously helpful in preventing granular tissue at the tracheostomy site as well as tracheal damage internally. So huge benefit. And then up to the left-hand corner, you do see a TTS water cuff. Again, nice tube because it allows for inflation and protection of the airway and ventilation that also can be put down, and it's just like a cuffless tube, allows air to move and flow nicely for speaking. And then many different companies also can create custom links. These are nice to bypass tracheal malacia or tracheal stenosis so that we can actually sometimes even decrease the PEEP levels needed and have intermittent disconnections from the ventilator circuit without having to use the ventilator for stenting. Another one of my favorite buddies, and this just shows a great reason why to have that FlexGen tube, and I will tell you that we would get patients at Rankin Jordan from acute care settings, and people would kind of tease me a little bit about always going to those flex tubes that you see here. But I really felt like it was important. They were a little more expensive, but they really allowed us to get those kiddos up and out of bed. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about their mobility program, but for us, that was huge. It was so important for kids that had maybe been practically stuck in an ICU bed for weeks, maybe even months, maybe their whole life. This little guy that you see here, when he came to us, he was scared to death. He had never been outside an NICU and or an isolation room. And so to get him up and to be held and play every day was a big deal. And we wanted to make sure that we were able to provide that for him. I mentioned too a little bit about the ability to have cuff down or cuffless tubes and how important they are for the use of speaking valves. Again, no disclosure, financial disclosures here with any companies that make speaking valves, and there are multiple ones out there. But I love speaking valves. I think they are just crucial to pediatric development. Kids learn how to talk because they hear themselves babble, and they mimic us. And sometimes as they get a little older, I know I have an 8-year-old, and I don't always like to hear her mimic me and sound just like me, but they do. That's how they learn, right? So having the ability to put a speaking valve in line early so that that patient can talk and babble and hear themselves. Other things, not just that development piece, but also for feedings. Think about the last time you had a really bad cold and there was no air movement through your upper airway other than breathing through your mouth, so no nose breathing. Did everything taste funny? So that's really one of the things that I learned partnering with our speech therapist at the hospital and our OTs, helping to recognize the benefit of speaking valves to pressurize that upper airway so that our kids can have the ability to have a better experience tasting. Next thing to consider, monitoring and monitoring devices. What is your patient currently utilizing? What kind of technology are you currently utilizing? So everything from our standard pulse oximetry to maybe our higher end pulse oximetry with motion detection, or the ability to look at methemoglobin, capnography, other types of CO2 monitoring, like the Syntec monitoring that uses transcutaneous technology. All of these are awesome technologies, and we tend to use them a lot in critical care. Unfortunately, when we get to particularly the home setting, we're probably only going to get basic pulse oximetry. That's all that's going to be reimbursed. So if you are in a very dependent, quote-unquote dependent mode on being able to watch that transcutaneous or that end-tidal CO2 daily, or even moment to moment on continuous measurements, probably not ready to go home. And so that's one of the reasons why we might want to think about an intermediary space. So not acute care, but not home care yet. These are usually spaces, your adults, we tend to call them LTAC spaces, or maybe even skilled nursing facilities that have weaning programs, and our pediatric subacute hospitals. Many of them offer what we call a non-invasive model, meaning they may not be drawing blood gases on a regular basis, and quite frankly, really shouldn't. If patients are stable enough that they are in the transition to home mode. Hopefully we're not drawing blood gases on a regular basis, but we could be utilizing capnography or transcutaneous monitoring to continue that weaning process. So think about that, be mindful of that. I know I have an example of a patient that I went in to see one time to work on the transition, and the therapist was very proud to click on and open the chart and show me all the blood gases that had been done over the last 2 to 3 days. And that actually raised a red flag for me. And I asked, why were we drawing so many blood gases? If we're in an active weaning situation and there isn't transcutaneous or capnography available, first I might ask why. But if the patient was, quote unquote, in a stability standpoint, we really shouldn't be having to draw a lot of blood gases. So, so think about that when you're making that transition. Are we stabilizing out? Do we need to be drawing as many blood gases? Can we utilize non-invasive technologies? Or are we really ready to go down to just some pulse oximetry monitoring? What about pulmonary clearance? So this is not an exhaustive picture set of some of the items that are out there. There are many more, but I just want to give you kind of an idea in your mind about some of the things that are out there for pulmonary clearance and recruitment. And if you come from a critical care setting, you are all but very familiar with all of these adjuncts. In the hospitals, most of our hospitals, particularly in the United States, we have access to a lot of different therapies. And so many times, if we're really aggressively weaning, we're aggressively using recruitment and pulmonary clearance methods. And we may be using all 3 of these, or maybe even more technologies, including that big circle in the middle, that conventional CPT and postural drainage. Unfortunately, when the patient goes into a home care setting, these adjuncts may none of them be available, or more typically what I hear is that the insurance company or the third-party payer will pay for one of these high expense adjuncts every 5 years. So one of the things for us to think about when we're trying to quote-unquote wean off patients from multiple technologies is what one is going to grow with them for the next 5 years. Do we expect this patient's condition to get worse and need a more aggressive technology? Or are they sort of a status quo where a standard technology might be able to work? One thing I really don't like to see, and is really a setup for failure for transition to the home care environment directly from critical care, is that we go from throwing everything at the patient but the kitchen sink. So we're using IPV, we're using cough assist, we're using a chest wall oscillatory, and we may be even beating on them a little bit on the side with conventional CPT and postural drainage. And now we're getting ready to go home, and all of a sudden, all they're going to get is some conventional CPT and postural drainage by a family member who may or may not be trained to do it all that well. So really think about that, because if you're really utilizing all those adjuncts and the patient really needs them all, a cold turkey switch from what you're doing in the hospital to just conventional CPT is probably not going to cut it. I referenced the Respiratory Care 2007 Airway Clearance Consensus Conference, specifically to remind myself to mention that the consensus conference really did go over some of the different adjuncts that are available and which ones might be better for different situations. And you can reference that if you have the opportunity or are interested, which ones might be better for different situations. But really, at the end of the day, the consensus conference said that there really isn't one adjunct that's good for every patient. So we really should be considering individualizing, whether it's a chest wall oscillatory, cough assist, IPV, or other therapy, what's really best for that particular patient. And give it a shot while you're still in the hospital with just that therapy and see, does it work or are we having setbacks? What about humidification? So typically in our critical care environments, high-end critical care environments, we're using at least some traditional active humidity. Ideally, these traditional active humidity devices are going to be providing 44 milligrams of water per liter and at body temperature and saturation. One of the things that we don't like to maybe think about with traditional active humidity is that if we aren't setting those optimally, we aren't getting optimal humidification. So turning the temperature way down to help decrease the amount of rain out that we have in tubings and those kinds of things actually can decrease the amount of humidification that the patient's getting. So looking at that and recognizing, number one, do we need or do we want ideal humidification, optimal humidification for at least some hours of the day, or is the patient going to tolerate being off of that? Traditional HMEs, we see that traditional HMEs will typically provide somewhere in the 28 milligrams per liter, milligrams of water vapor per liter, but we might be able to get some more high efficiency HMEs that will provide more. And then a new device that's on the market is the booster device, which utilizes both an HME, so passive humidification, and an active humidification system closer to the patient. These devices don't claim to be able to provide ideal humidity at 44 milligrams of water vapor per liter, but they get fairly close. So it may be an opportunity to start looking at how much does the patient tolerate being away from that ideal saturation of water vapor. The biggest reason why I ask that people take a look at this before the transition is that when you are in a hospital setting, we have in the United States some of the best HVAC systems in the world in our hospitals. Our temperature is very controlled, our humidity is very controlled inside the hospital, and so these active humidification systems work very, very well and are great for our patients. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it, as patients transition to a subacute setting, say a skilled nursing facility or an area of subacute where they're trying to get the patients more active, up and mobile, or trying to make it more like home. Windows up, time spent outside. Patients are going to need to be off of the active humidity and on some sort of HME device, and may not have the opportunity to have active humidification 24/7, 365. So looking at what the patient will tolerate prior to discharge is always going to be beneficial. What if a patient can't do without a high level of equipment? Well, here's where our interim locations, or as our subacute setting group like to call it, the middle space. So the middle space can be a great place for patients to transition that we may think we may be able to continue to wean if we have the ability to use capnography or transcutaneous monitoring. Maybe the family's not quite ready for the person to come home. Maybe we have some other little kinks to work out along the way. So looking at a intermediary location can be very, very, very helpful. And I actually recommend to facilities that you look at that really early on. You know, if we consider long-term ventilated at 28 days, we should probably be considering that at the time that a patient is being trached. What are we going to do if we can't get them off the vent? And where might they go? So this is a little bit more speaking to discharge planners and hospital therapists. Do your homework. Not all facilities are alike, and I can tell you this from firsthand experience of 22 years of working in critical care and subacute and home care spaces, that all of these environments are not alike. Ask questions. What technology are they going to have available to them? Will they be able to continue weaning with capnography or some other non-invasive modality? Do they have an aggressive weaning program? If someone isn't going to come off the vent, say for example someone with ALS or a quad, what is the optimization plan? What does that facility have planned for that person to try to get them in the best shape possible to either live out their days at that facility and hopefully enjoying a really high quality of life, or getting them ready to go home? What's the plan for that, and what do they offer? How often do patients or residents get out of their room, and what kind of activities are scheduled? Absolutely ask those questions, and I ask family members to ask those questions as well when they're looking at a facility. Visit. You never know what you're going to walk into until you really walk in. And so I really encourage people to make a visit. I know for us critical care therapists, sometimes we think, oh, I can't talk, I can't do it, I can't go into someplace like that and even stand to see these folks that are going to spend the rest of their days in a location like this. But there's actually some really inspiring places out there, and I want to share a little bit more with you about that. Soon, there's going to be more data on readmits. So as part of the Affordable Care Act, as we all know in critical care, there is going to be penalties for patients that bounce back for particular diagnoses within the first 30 and or 60 days. So hospitals are really going to want to start tracking this right away if you haven't already. If your patient goes to X LTAC or skilled nursing facility or subacute center, or even goes home with a certain DME providing equipment and oversight, do they frequently come back within 30 days? I would suggest that most critical care environments need to be looking at this data, collecting it, paying attention, because it is really going to be important to the critical care settings bottom line, and not just what's good for the patient, but what's good for the facility. I have a case of Miss R down here at the bottom because I just want to give examples of some things that have happened in my experience. A couple of years ago, I went into an adult skilled nursing facility that provided long-term ventilation. I was asked to go in with a durable medical equipment company that was just getting started doing ventilator patients, and they kind of wanted me there for some moral support and to be able to answer questions about the particular ventilator that I represent. And as I went in, I had previously looked at the chart and seen that this lady was a quadriplegic. She was 37 years old when she was injured. She had been at the facility for about 2 years. And I expected to see a very different picture. I expected to see a lot of challenges. I expected to see maybe a patient who had some other deficits or not a supportive family and or other problems. And what I discovered to my taking aback but also happily surprised was to find a woman who was a quadriplegic, but she was amazingly articulate. She was a great gal. We hit it off immediately. The room was filled with about 10 wonderful family members who were excited to be there and learn about how they could get their mom and daughter home from this facility. And after spending some time talking with her about how we could completely take her cuff down and how we could maybe introduce a speaking valve so that her voice projection could be better, and just discussing the situation with her, I found out that she hadn't been out of her room other than to the tub room in 2 years. Now this woman was, like I said, she was a model patient. She was a patient family that every respiratory therapist wants to meet, and I was shocked and stunned and amazed that she had not been given the opportunity to look for ways to go home before this. She looked at me before I left the room and said, "Where were you 2 years ago?" And kind of swallowing hard and holding back some tears, I said to her, "You know what? I'm here today, and we're going to figure out how to get you home." And I am happy to say, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of her for you, but she got to go to her very first sensor accident St. Louis Cardinals baseball game recently. And she is living at home and thriving and very successful. So be aware, guys, these are our folks, these are our people that we have learned to love and care about, and really put some thought into what is the next step for them. To that point, I'm going to get a shameless plug in here. This is my former place of employment, Lincoln Jordan Pediatric Hospital. This is a 34-bed subacute facility northwest of St. Louis City. And again, there is a YouTube link that I know you will not have time to copy down. So again, if you're interested in looking at it, you can go to rankinjordan.org and look these up. Or you can just email me and I'll just send you the URL. I encourage you, if you really want to be inspired by a 5-minute video about expanding what opportunities there are for pediatric patients in the subacute space, or maybe you work in a facility that's a subacute setting, either adult or pediatric, and you're looking for new ideas on how to push the envelope, watch this video. It is absolutely amazing. The things that they're doing there, and the biggest piece of it is the mobility program. This video that you will see if you go to this link opens with a piece about their program called Beyond the Bedside, where every single tracheostomized and ventilated patient is up by 8:30 in the morning and is active as much as they possibly physically can be. So it's very inspiring what's happening. I threw this in there just to remind myself to have you guys go again to this. If you don't have time to look at anything else, look at the story of Margaret. Margaret was a little cheerleader in like a select cheer group, and she had an injury to her spinal cord, and there is a little video clip of her joining her cheer team on the floor. In her chair with her ventilator on the back of her chair, and it's really inspiring. So I encourage you guys to take a chance to take a look at that when you have the opportunity. Not just for pediatrics. I have to brag on this facility that I have come across and have worked with over the last few years. Tucked away in a little bitty town of Keokuk, Iowa, is a place called Lexington Square. And they have an amazing wean rate there for our patients who have come to them that have, been through their critical care, been through their LTAC stay, and they are continuing to find ways to get these folks off of the ventilator and active. So they have a aggressive pulmonary clearance program. They have a utilization of spontaneous breathing trial feature on their ventilator that they use on all patients that qualify. And again, a 60% wean rate in a skilled nursing facility, I think is absolutely phenomenal. Other things that we need to look at and identify are things like who is going to be our equipment supplier. So let's say we're at the point that we're ready to discharge to home. Who is going to be that equipment supplier? So we want to look for places that can do both feedings and ventilators if we need both of those. Sometimes that is not available in the community, so we may have to go with 2 separate companies. But obviously, reducing the number of vendors that have to be in and out of the patient home is ideal. Does the provider provide a brand or model of ventilator that you prefer? Many of our acute care hospitals now have purchased their own subacute style ventilators. So I will use, for an example, hospital may have LTV 1200s that has a blender that they use in the hospital, but then has the ability to bypass that blender, turning it essentially into an LTV 1150 or an 1100. Many of the other home care ventilators, I know that the HT70 has a similar type of feature on it. So a lot of times we're seeing the critical care hospitals purchasing those ventilators so that they can get aggressive with that transition piece. So when you're looking at the provider for the home care setting, do they provide that same ventilator? Are you going to be able to go ahead and aggressively get that patient on that subacute vent and then move forward with asking the DME to come in or not. If the provider doesn't offer the ventilator that you prefer, that your facility works with, it doesn't mean that they can't do the ventilation for that patient. Especially in rural communities, we may be limited on the DMEs that we have available to us. Try to work with those therapists at those DMEs. They have made clinical and or business decisions about the ventilators that they will be providing. And so if the ventilator that they provide can provide all the features and technology that you need for that particular patient, work with them. Many times I know as a representative of an equipment company, a lot of times I'll be willing to go in and help with that transition so that we can ensure that coming from the critical care ventilator onto that home care ventilator goes as smoothly as possible. Does the equipment company provide training? I'm going to spend 2 slides on training because it is super important, guys. Who is going to provide the training? Who's going to work with the caregivers, the nursing staff that are either providing daily nursing visits or providing hourly nursing? I know in Missouri, our adult patients don't typically get nursing hours. Our pediatric patients do, and we work together with those nursing agencies to make sure the nurses are trained on the basics of troubleshooting and working with the ventilator, but not all of our adult patients do. So working with the caregivers and understanding who needs to understand that ventilator and troubleshooting is tremendously important. Who's going to train your hospital staff if the DME wants to bring in a ventilator that you're not familiar with? Again, talk with that durable medical equipment company. They may be willing to provide some training, and or the manufacturer of that particular ventilator is often willing to come in and do support with your staff. You shouldn't be expected to provide 24/7 care on a patient on a ventilator that you have never seen before. But also please try to be open to looking at adjunct tools such as DVD or online training. And again, ask. Many times I find that people just they don't think to ask, and I'm always willing to, if I possibly can, go in and do that training, and I know many manufacturers offer that service as well. So always ask, and most of the time you'll find that people will be willing to try to work with you to get that patient home. Home care providers. This is my support for our DME therapists. Please give them 2 weeks to get people ready. They have a lot of training to do. They have to check out the home. Is it electrical safety tested? Is there, other problems that are going to arise because of the home? Trust me, you want them to be prepared, critical care therapists, because again, if our patients come back to us in a short period of time, not only is that not good for the patients, but it's going to start financially impacting our healthcare facilities. So please be thinking ahead, work with them, and they will usually be able to provide that in a 2-week window of preparation and home time. Who's the third-party payer? That's a big hot topic in the United States right now, right? Who's actually going to be paying the bill? We're starting to think about that a little bit more as healthcare and healthcare provision, as well as healthcare reimbursement, is sort of at the top of the news lines. But we need to think about that. We need to think about, are there in or out of network providers? Many times, if the only in-network provider does not do ventilation, so if you're going home with a DME and the in-network DME does not provide ventilators, you can get a waiver so that another DME can provide that with the in-network pricing. So look for that as an option. What about other hospital or possible home support? Like, does the family need a generator? Are they very rural? Sometimes there are grants available in the community, and sometimes our Medicaid, state Medicaids will help to pay for things like this so that patients can get safely discharged. How many nursing hours are going to get approved? What if something is not going to be paid for that you really feel is important? So say that extra adjunct pulmonary clearance device or a second ventilator for travel. This is one thing I always plug. Don't give up. Don't give up. There are many private and charitable organizations in communities that will help you to get things paid for. I will tell you that one time I did some training in a place in Nebraska, and it was actually an EMS setting. They had all this wonderful equipment, and we're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and I started asking questions about it, and they said, no, really, we raised all of the funds for these $30,000 defibrillators by selling barbecue chicken and pull tabs. So I had to smile and think about all the work the volunteers in that community had put in to providing an EMS service that was well equipped, and many times we can find charitable organizations who are willing to work with us to help see someone get home safely. Identifying caregivers, we need at least 2 caregivers in the home. Many times we will not have nursing hours, so identifying good caregivers. Who are they? Do they work? How committed are they? Don't ever let anyone try to go it alone. The best intentioned people need a break. So keep that in mind. Look for family caregivers and support system that is sustainable. Transportation. How's the patient going to get home from the hospital? Is it safe? Do we need to make arrangements other than a private car? Ambulances sometimes can be booked for this, for transport for folks home, but it's not always a cost-effective option. I know in St. Louis we have a couple of groups called Metro Call-A-Ride and EMT that are ADA approved, so there is reimbursement for them. They do not provide clinical care. They are specifically a transportation service, but they frequently will have an inverter for plugging things in, or you can plug into the cigarette lighter outlets that they offer, and they have lifts and those kinds of things. So those can be seen as an option. Always make sure that any equipment that you're going to be sending a patient home with is travel compliant. Check the labels. You might be surprised. Everything from ventilators to suction machines are sometimes not labeled or FDA approved for out-of-hospital transport. So make sure that the equipment that you're going to be sending somebody home with is approved and safe for that environment. Training, and more training. Again, 2 family members. Who's going to train the agency nurses? So if they do get hourly nursing, who's going to train those folks? That has been quite a dilemma in the St. Louis area over the years. From the time that I moved from acute care to subacute, working in home care, and now on the industry side of things, I've recognized that it's quite a challenge. I will tell you that since 2007, since Spiritus opened, myself and a few per diem folks who work with me have trained over 600 nurses in the St. Louis community, mostly LPNs, a few RNs, that are doing agency nursing services for ventilator-dependent patients. Most of these people had absolutely no ventilator training prior to going in and taking these cases. So recognizing it, we do not get paid for it, but we provide it because we know that it is needed. So in your community, look for how that's going to happen, who's going to train folks, and have an open discussion about how we can make that happen most economically. I do want to mention a program that is specific to St. Louis that combines a classroom and a hands-on instruction with a sim lab experience. St. Louis Children's Hospital, an affiliate of Washington University, began these programs a few years ago. These nurses, the program is free of charge, believe it or not, and they do accept nurses from out of the area. So for more information about how to get enrolled or enroll nurses in your area into this program, again, email me. and I'm happy to forward this information on to you. What this program does is it brings nurses in for a 4-hour experience, 2 hours is classroom with some hands-on with a ventilator. Then we take the nurses in groups of 2 into the sim lab where we create specific scenarios and let those nurses work through them just like it's a real live patient. And we're actually doing a clinical study with this to determine after a sim lab experience, do nurses come out more confident with more confident skills? And we believe that they will. We hypothesize that they will, but we don't know that for sure. So we're looking at studying that through Washington University and their sim lab. So it's a great program. Again, WashU and St. Louis Children's Hospital offers it free of charge. It is limited to 10 nurses per program because we want to create the highest quality program possible. So if there's a program in your area, check with the facilities, the hospitals, and the DMEs. There may be something similar in your area. More training. So everybody's got to be touched, from local ambulance services to critical access hospitals that may be an intermediary before a patient would be readmitted to critical care, and making sure that all those folks are aware of what's going on. This is doable. I cannot tell you how rewarding it has been to work in critical care, subacute home care, and now in industry, but still spending lots of time connecting with patients and families. Ventilator-dependent people can thrive at home, and with the right mindset and prep, you can really help them be successful. This little girl that you see in the picture here lives outside of Springfield, Illinois. This is actually a picture after she went home on her ventilator and was actually in their little local parade for either 4th of July or Labor Day, I don't remember which. And she has since come off the ventilator, is decannulated, and has a little sibling younger than her now. So families do thrive. Folks thrive at home. It is doable with all the right pieces. So get your patients prepared. Consider the equipment that you need, your home care supplier and your third-party payer. I cannot emphasize enough training and communication. So closing with the case of Miss R, kind of told the whole story at the beginning, but it was just great to find out that she is able to be active in the community. And I hope that your patients and your ventilator dependent folks in your area have the same experiences. So how about this for getting out? Now, this is a life, right? So I enjoy riding around on a speedboat, so I'm sure this little guy does as well. And with that, I am going to close. My email address is on there. It is VENTL, the number 8, at sbcglobal.net. Please feel free to email me. And if we have time, I think Shauna's going to open the mic for questions, or is going to be reading questions that are posted.
Thank you, Rhonda. That was fantastic. I am going to be reading questions. The one question I think is on everyone's mind, and I'm not sure how much information we have on this, but I'm hoping you can shed a little bit of light. Do we at this point have any information or estimation on the effect of the ACA on preparing the technology-dependent patient for home? How that's going to impact?
I don't think that we have anything in hard numbers yet, Shauna, and I will tell you that I stay closely in contact with folks I'm a member of the long-term care section. So if you work in that space, I encourage you to join that extra membership of that long-term care section because those kinds of things do come up and are discussed. I have not seen anything out there quite yet, but certainly at the last AARC in our section meeting, there was discussion about how critical care hospitals are already looking at the data and having discussions with skilled nursing facilities and DMEs about how they can work together to keep patients in the next level of care.
Thank you. So as kind of a parting thought, if you could provide us maybe with one key point for both the hospital-based respiratory therapist and a key point for the home-based respiratory therapist? What would you say is the major takeaway here?
My major takeaway for this for all respiratory therapists and quite frankly all caregivers across the spectrum is be a team player. Partner with the experts in that particular environment. If you are the critical care therapist, you should know your ventilator inside and out. You should know how the rise time works and how the termination sensitivity or eSense works on your ventilator. And be ready to work together with that subacute or home care therapist to make that transition. Conversely, subacute and home care folks, you're expected to know your ventilator inside and out as well so that you can team up and work together to make that happen. And everybody has to be a team player in the training. So really working together, and don't give up. If I get a sidebar, if I get number 2, is don't give up, because so many times I've seen patients that just needed that little extra time or extra subacute level or extra effort from somebody who really cares about that family and patient. And it can happen.
Rhonda, thank you again for joining us today. For those of you watching this as a live presentation, please stay with us during the next brief pause for instructions on how to obtain your CRCE contact hour. If you are watching this program as an archive, this concludes our presentation.